The stars burned with an unnatural light as the alien ships moved through space like a plague of metal and fire. The Zephyrian Armada had been cutting through human colonies for 3 long months, and they showed no signs of slowing down. 17 worlds had already fallen to their massive ships, each one the size of a small city. The aliens moved with perfect timing, their strange biomechanical vessels learning from every human attack and getting stronger with each battle. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UE's Liberty, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. In front of him, red dots filled the screen, showing enemy ships that outnumbered the human fleet by 20 to 1. The blue dots that represented human vessels looked pathetically small in comparison. The Battle of Kepler Station had been humanity's last real chance to stop the invasion, and they had lost badly. Now only scattered groups of Earth Defense Force ships remained, running and hiding from an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The Liberty was a Hercules-class destroyer, built for speed rather than heavy fighting. Jake had watched bigger and more powerful ships get torn apart by the Zephyrian swarm attacks. His ship was fast and could turn quickly, which had kept them alive so far. But he knew that being the last command ship in this part of space meant making choices that no person should have to make. Commander Lisa Brooks, his second in command, turned away from her station with bad news written all over her face. "Sir, we've lost contact with Admiral Peterson's flagship. The Titan's Fury stopped transmitting 15 minutes ago." Her voice carried the weight of defeat that had settled over all the surviving crews like a heavy blanket. Jake nodded slowly. He had expected this news, but it still hit him hard. Admiral Peterson had been a good leader and a better friend. The Titan's Fury was one of the most powerful ships in the human fleet, and if it was gone, then things were even worse than he had thought. Any word from the other ships in Peterson's group? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "Nothing. Sir, we're picking up debris fields where they should be." Lisa's voice was steady, but Jake could see the pain in her eyes. They had all lost friends in this war, and it was getting harder to keep fighting when every battle ended the same way. Lieutenant Danny Carter looked up from the communication station, his young face pale with exhaustion. "Captain, we're receiving new orders from Earth Command. All remaining vessels are to fall back to the Sol system for a final defensive stand around Earth." Jake studied the star charts on his screen. The retreat route would take them through several systems where civilian evacuation ships were still trying to escape. Cargo haulers, passenger liners, and anything else that could carry people were fleeing toward the inner colonies. These ships were slow and defenseless, filled with families and children who had already lost their homes to the alien invasion. The Zephyrians had shown no mercy to civilians. They attacked evacuation ships just as ruthlessly as they attacked military targets. Jake had seen the recordings from the Centauri system, where thousands of refugees had died when their transport ships were destroyed trying to run from the alien fleet. The images still haunted his dreams. How long until the evacuation fleet clears this sector? Jake asked his navigation officer. Lieutenant Amy Foster checked her calculations twice before answering. "At their current speed, sir, they need at least 18 hours to reach the jump point for hyperspace. The cargo ships are heavily loaded and can't go any faster." Jake felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. 18 hours was a lifetime in space combat, especially against an enemy that moved as fast as the Zephyrians. If the Liberty retreated now following orders, those civilian ships would be sitting ducks when the alien fleet arrived. "Sir, enemy contacts are increasing," reported sensor operator Helen Clark. "I'm reading multiple hyperspace signatures. Looks like the main Zephyrian fleet is about to arrive in this system." Jake moved to the main tactical display and studied the incoming data. The aliens were bringing everything they had. Massive dreadnoughts that could destroy entire cities with a single shot. Fast attack ships that moved in deadly swarms. Support. Vessels that could repair battle damage in minutes. It was a force that could crush any human fleet that tried to stand against it. How many ships are we talking about? Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Helen's fingers moved over her controls as she refined the sensor readings. Initial count shows at least 40 capital ships, sir. Plus escorts and support vessels. We're looking at over 100 enemy vessels total. The bridge fell silent as everyone processed this information. The Liberty was one ship with 300 crew members. The enemy was bringing a fleet that could conquer entire star systems. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and clear. Engineer Pete Hamilton's voice came through the intercom from the engine room. "Captain, I've been working on some modifications to our weapon systems. If we push the reactor beyond safe limits, we might be able to increase our firepower significantly. The downside is that the ship won't survive the strain for very long." Jake closed his eyes and tried to think. Every option he could see led to the same conclusion. The Liberty could retreat and follow orders, which meant saving his crew, but dooming 60,000 civilians. Or they could stay and fight, buying time for the evacuation fleet, but ensuring that none of them would see home again. He thought about his crew, good people who had followed him through 3 years of this war. They had families back on Earth, people who were counting on them to come home. But he also thought about the evacuation ships, packed with children who would never have a chance to grow up if the Zephyrians caught them. "Sir," Lisa said quietly, "the crew knows what's at stake here. We've all seen what happens to civilian ships when they can't get away in time." Jake looked around the bridge at his officers. These were the people he had trained and fought alongside for years. They were good soldiers and better human beings. He could see in their faces that they understood the choice as clearly as he did. "Lieutenant Carter, can you get me a secure channel to the evacuation fleet?" Jake asked. "Yes, sir. Channel open." Jake keyed the communications system, knowing that his next words would change everything. "Evacuation fleet, this is Captain Morrison. Aboard the Liberty. We're tracking a large enemy force heading your way. You need to push your engines harder and get to that jump point as fast as possible. We'll do what we can to buy you time." The response came back immediately from the lead. "Evacuation ship. Liberty, this is Captain Rodriguez on the transport ship New Hope. We're carrying 12,000 refugees, mostly families with children. Our engines are already at maximum safe power." "Then push them beyond safe power," Jake replied. "Do whatever you have to do, but get those people out of here. Liberty out." Jake turned to face his crew, seeing his own determination reflected in their faces. They all knew what this meant, and they were ready to do their duty. The Liberty was just one small ship against an entire alien fleet. But sometimes one ship was all that stood between civilization and darkness. The tactical display showed the enemy fleet getting closer, their ships moving in the perfect formations that had crushed human resistance across 17 worlds. In a few hours, they would reach this system and expect to find nothing but empty space and fleeing humans. Instead, they would find the U.S. Liberty waiting for them, ready to prove that humans would fight for strangers they had never met, even when victory was impossible. The invasion had rolled through human space for months, but it was about to meet something the aliens had not expected. A crew willing to sacrifice everything for people they would never see again. The bridge of the U.S. Liberty felt smaller than usual as Captain Jake Morrison stood looking at the star charts. The weight of an impossible decision pressed down on his shoulders like a physical thing. Around him, his officers worked quietly at their stations, but he could feel their eyes on him. They all knew what he was thinking about, and they were waiting for him to make the choice that would decide whether they lived or died. Jake had been in command of the Liberty for 2 years, and his crew trusted him completely. They had followed his orders through battles that should have killed them all, and they had never questioned his decisions. But this was different. This time, Following orders meant running away while innocent people died, and staying meant certain death for everyone on his ship. He thought about the evacuation ships struggling to reach safety. 60,000 people packed into cargo haulers and passenger liners that were never meant to carry so many. Families who had already lost their homes and everything they owned. Children who had never known anything but war and running from an enemy that seemed to win every battle. Commander Lisa Brooks moved to stand beside him at the tactical display. She had been his second in command since he took control of the Liberty, and she knew him better than anyone else on the ship. "The crew is ready for whatever you decide, sir," she said quietly, "but they deserve to know what they're facing." Jake nodded. His people had earned the right to understand the choice they were making together. He activated the ship's internal communication system and spoke to the entire crew. "All hands, this is the captain. I need to tell you about our situation and give you the facts so you can understand what we're dealing with." Throughout the ship, crew members stopped what they were doing to listen. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Pete Hamilton wiped grease from his hands and turned toward the nearest speaker. In the weapon bays, the gunners set down their tools and gathered around the communication panels. Everyone knew this was important. "The Zephyrian fleet will reach the system in approximately 6 hours, Jake continued. "We have orders to retreat to the Sol system, but there are 60,000 civilians in evacuation ships that need 18 hours to reach safety. If we leave now, those people will be defenseless when the aliens arrive." The ship was completely quiet except for the hum of the engines and the soft beeping of electronic systems. Jake could almost feel 300 people holding their breath as they waited for him to continue. "I won't lie to you about what staying means," Jake said. "The enemy is bringing over 100 ships, including dreadnoughts that outgun us by a factor of 50 to 1. If we stay and fight, we're not going home. But if we run, those evacuation ships won't make it either." In the mess hall, cook Bobby Martinez stopped preparing the evening meal and sat down heavily in a chair. He thought about his wife and 2 kids back on Earth, waiting for him to come home from this war. But he also thought about the families on those slow-moving evacuation ships, probably eating cold rations and trying to keep their children calm while they ran for their lives. Lieutenant Danny Carter looked up from his communication station. His hands were shaking slightly as he thought about the choice they were facing. He was only 23 years old, fresh out of the academy, and he had never imagined being in a situation like this. "Sir, what about our families? What about the people waiting for us to come home?" It was the question everyone was thinking, and Jake was glad someone had asked it. "That's exactly why we have to make this choice," he said. "Our families are safe in the inner colonies. The people on those evacuation ships don't have anyone else to protect them. If we don't stand up for them, who will?" Chief Engineer Pete Hamilton's voice came through the intercom from the engine room. "Captain, I've been running calculations on those weapon modifications I mentioned. If we overload the plasma torpedo systems, we can increase our firepower by 300%. The reactors can handle it for about 6 hours before they blow." Jake felt a grim smile cross his face. Pete always had a way of making impossible things sound routine. "What about the engines? Can we get more speed?" "I can push them to 120% for the same time period," Pete replied. "After that, we'll be lucky if life support keeps working." Tactical Officer Roy Jenkins pulled up the sensor readings on his screen. "Captain, I've been analyzing the enemy formation patterns from previous battles. They rely on overwhelming firepower and numbers, but they're not used to fighting in confined spaces. If we could force them into a narrow approach, we might be able to level the playing field." Navigation Officer Amy Foster highlighted a section of the star chart. "The Meridian Nebula has a natural choke point where their larger ships would have to come at us one at a time. The asteroid field would limit their mobility advantage." Jake studied the tactical situation. The Meridian Nebula was a dangerous place. For any ship, filled with dense gas clouds and spinning rocks that could crush a vessel if the pilot made a mistake. But it was also the perfect place for a small, fast ship to make a stand against a larger force. "How long would it take us to reach the nebula?" Jake asked. Amy checked her calculations. "At maximum speed, about 90 minutes, sir." Jake turned to face his officers, seeing determination in their faces despite the fear he knew they all felt. These were good people who had signed up to protect humanity, and they understood what that meant even when the cost was everything they had. "I need to know if you're with me on this," Jake said. "I won't order anyone to stay and die. This has to be a choice you make freely." Lieutenant Commander Roy Jenkins was the first to speak. "Sir, I've been thinking about this since we got the evacuation alert. My sister lives on New Terra with her kids. If the Zephyrians break through here, her world is next in line. I'm not running away and leaving other families to face what she might have to face." Sensor operator Helen Clark nodded. "My parents were on one of the evacuation ships from the Tau Ceti system. They made it out because someone else held the line long enough for them to escape. I owe the same thing to those people out there." One by one, the officers on the bridge spoke up. They talked about family members who had been saved by other crews making hard choices. They talked about the responsibility that came with wearing a uniform and serving on a warship. They talked about the kind of galaxy they wanted to leave behind for the next generation. Down in the engine room, Pete Hamilton was having the same conversation with his technical crew. The mechanics and engineers understood better than anyone what the ship could and couldn't do. They knew that pushing the systems beyond their limits meant certain destruction. But they also knew that sometimes machines had to be sacrificed for the people they were built to protect. In the weapons bay, the gunners were checking their equipment and preparing for a battle they couldn't win. Sergeant Mike O'Brien had been in space combat for 15 years, and he had never seen odds this bad. But he had also never felt more sure about doing the right thing. The mess hall had become an impromptu meeting place where crew members from different departments gathered to talk about the choice they were making. Nobody was pretending it would be easy, and nobody was pretending they weren't scared. But they were also proud to be part of something bigger than themselves. Lieutenant Carter's voice came over the intercom with an update from the communication center. "Captain, I'm getting reports from other ships in the area. 3 destroyers and a cruiser are requesting permission to join us at the nebula." Jake felt a surge of emotion that he quickly pushed down. Other crews had made the same choice, deciding that some things were worth dying for. "Tell them they're welcome to join the party, but make sure they understand what they're signing up for." The Liberty's engines hummed with increased power as Amy Foster set course for the Meridian Nebula. Behind them, the evacuation fleet continued its desperate race toward safety, unaware that a handful of warships had decided to buy them the time they needed with their lives. Jake looked around the bridge one more time, memorizing the faces of the people who had chosen to stand with him. In a few hours, they would face an enemy that had conquered 17 worlds and destroyed every human fleet sent against them. The mathematics said they had no chance of survival, but Jake Morrison had learned something important during his years in command. Mathematics didn't account for the human spirit, and sometimes that made all the difference in the galaxy. The Meridian Nebula stretched across space like a frozen storm made of gas and light. Colors that had no names on Earth swirled through the cosmic clouds, and massive asteroids tumbled slowly through the dense fog of particles. It was one of the most dangerous places in known space, where navigation computers failed and sensors couldn't see more than a few kilometers in any direction. For most ship captains, the nebula was something to avoid at all costs, but Captain Jake Morrison was not most captains, and the UE's Liberty was running out of options. The destroyer moved carefully through the outer edge of the nebula, its sensors struggling to map the chaotic maze of rocks and gas clouds ahead. This would be their battlefield, and Jake needed to understand every advantage the strange environment could give them. "Sensor range is down to 3 kilometers, reported Helen Clark from her station. "The nebula is interfering with almost everything. Long-range communications are completely blocked." Jake nodded as he studied the tactical display. The limited sensor range was bad news and good news at the same time. The Liberty wouldn't be able to see the enemy coming until they were very close, but the Zephyrians would have the same problem. Their advanced biomechanical sensors were no better than human technology when dealing with the nebula's interference. "Chief." Engineer Pete Hamilton's voice came through the intercom from deep in the ship's engine room. "Captain, I've finished the modifications to our weapon systems. The plasma torpedoes are now carrying triple the normal explosive yield, but the power drain is enormous. We'll get maybe 6 shots before the weapon systems overload and shut down permanently." "What about the engines?" Jake asked. "I've bypassed about half the safety systems," Pete replied. "We can run at 120% power for approximately 4 hours. After that, the fusion reactor will start to break down and we'll lose power completely." Navigation Officer Amy Foster highlighted a section of the nebula on her screen. "Captain, I found what might be the perfect position for us. There's a narrow canyon between 2 massive asteroids about 20 kilometers inside the nebula. Any ship trying to reach us would have to come through a passage that's only about 2 kilometers wide." Jake moved to look at Amy's findings. The canyon was like a natural fortress with walls of solid rock on both sides and only one way in or out. A large fleet would have to approach in single file, unable to use their numerical advantage. It was exactly what they needed. "How stable are those asteroids?" Jake asked. Amy ran some quick calculations. "They're in a stable orbit around each other, but if something hit them hard enough, they could shift position. The passage might close completely." That gave Jake an idea, but he kept it to himself for now. "Take us to that position. We'll make our stand there." The Liberty moved deeper into the nebula, navigating by instruments that barely functioned in the electromagnetic chaos surrounding them. The ship's hull groaned as it passed through pockets of dense gas, and the lights flickered when particularly strong energy fields interfered with the electrical systems. Lieutenant Danny Carter looked up from his communication station with frustration written across his face. "Sir, I've lost contact with the other ships that were coming to join us. The nebula is blocking all radio signals." "They'll find us," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. "Keep broadcasting our position on all frequencies." 20 minutes later, the first of the other human ships emerged from the swirling gas clouds. It was the destroyer U.S. Defiant, commanded by Captain Beth Sullivan. Jake had served with Beth years ago, and he wasn't surprised that she had chosen to join the hopeless fight. "Liberty, this is Defiant," came Beth's voice over the short range. "Radio, sorry we're late to the party. This place is a nightmare to navigate." "Glad you could make it," Jake replied. "We're setting up defensive positions in the canyon ahead. Follow our lead." 2 more ships appeared over the next hour. The cruiser U.S. Ranger and the destroyer U.S. Hornet brought the total human force to 4 ships with just over 1,000 crew members. It was still a tiny force compared to what the Zephyrians were bringing, but Jake felt better knowing they wouldn't face the enemy alone. Captain Tom Bradley of the Ranger was the senior officer among the group, but he deferred to Jake's tactical plan. "This is your show, Morrison. We're here to follow your lead." Jake gathered the other captains for a strategy meeting over the radio. "The enemy will have to come through that narrow passage to reach us. We'll position ourselves at the far end of the canyon with overlapping fields of fire. When they enter the passage, we hit them with everything we have." Captain Susan Lee of the Hornet studied the tactical situation. "What about when they bring up their heavy ships? Those dreadnoughts have enough firepower to blast through the asteroid walls." "That's where Pete's modifications come in," Jake explained. We've enhanced our torpedo warheads to 3 times normal yield. If we can hit those asteroids at the right spots, we might be able to bring them down and block the passage. It was a desperate plan that relied on perfect timing and a lot of luck, but it was the only chance they had. The 4 ships took their positions at the back of the canyon, with the Liberty in the center, and the others spread out to cover as much space as possible. Chief Engineer Pete Hamilton reported from the Liberty's engine room. All modifications are complete, Captain. Weapons are at maximum power, and engines are ready for combat operations. The reactor is running hot, but it should hold together for the time we need. Jake looked around the bridge at his crew. They had been working for hours to prepare for this battle, checking systems and running diagnostics on equipment that was being pushed far beyond its normal limits. Everyone looked tired, but their faces showed determination rather than fear. How long until the enemy arrives? Jake asked. Sensor operator Helen Clark checked her readings. Best estimate is 90 minutes, sir. The evacuation fleet reports they're still 12 hours away from the jump point. Jake did the math in his head. They needed to hold the Zephyrians here for at least 10 more hours to give the civilian ships enough time to escape. With the weapon modifications, they might be able to put up a good fight for the first few hours, but after that, they would be fighting with damaged systems and dwindling power. He activated the ship's internal communication system to address his crew one final time before the battle began. All hands, this is the captain. In about an hour, we're going to face an enemy that has conquered 17 human worlds. They've never been stopped, and they've never been defeated. But they've also never faced people like us. Throughout the ship, crew members stopped what they were doing to listen. In the weapons bay, the gunners made final adjustments to their targeting systems. In the medical bay, Dr. Karen White prepared for casualties that she knew would be coming. In the engine room, Pete Hamilton watched the reactor temperature gauges climb toward the red line. We're not fighting for glory or medals, Jake continued. We're fighting for 60,000 people who are counting on us to buy them time. We're fighting for families and children who deserve a chance to live free from fear. And we're fighting to prove that humans don't back down when innocent lives are at stake. The Liberty shuddered slightly as the engines reached full power. All around the ship, systems hummed with energy that was barely contained within safe limits. The destroyer was like a coiled spring, ready to unleash everything it had in one final battle. Battle stations, Jake ordered. All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. Throughout the 4 human ships, alarm bells rang as crews prepared for combat. Weapon systems came online, targeting computers activated, and damage control. Teams took their positions. In the depths of space, surrounded by the swirling chaos of the Meridian Nebula, 1,000 human beings prepared to face impossible odds. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Liberty and watched the sensor displays for the first signs of the enemy fleet. Somewhere out there in the nebula, the Zephyrian armada was approaching, confident that they would sweep aside any human resistance, just as they had done 17 times before. But this time would be different. This time, they would face humans who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The first sign of the enemy came as a whisper on the sensors. Sensor operator Helen Clark leaned forward at her station, adjusting the controls to filter out the nebula's interference. Contact bearing 090, range approximately 8 kilometers. Single ship moving slowly through the outer gas clouds. Captain Jake Morrison felt his heart rate increase as the moment they had been preparing for finally arrived. Classification? Zephyrian scout vessel, sir. Looks like they're being careful about entering the nebula. Helen's fingers moved quickly over her console as she tried to get more information. Through the electromagnetic soup surrounding them, Jake activated the tactical communication channel that connected all 4 human ships. All vessels, this is Liberty Actual. We have our first contact. Scout ship probing the nebula entrance. Maintain radio silence and hold your positions. The UES Liberty sat motionless in the asteroid canyon, its engines running at minimum power to avoid detection. Around them, the other 3 human ships waited in carefully chosen positions that would give them overlapping fields of fire when the real battle began. The modified weapon systems hummed with barely contained energy, ready to unleash their enhanced firepower at a moment's notice. Chief Engineer Pete Hamilton's voice came quietly through the intercom. "Captain, all systems are green across the board. Reactor temperature is holding steady at 95% of maximum. We're as ready as we'll ever be." Minutes crawled by as the Zephyrian scout moved deeper into the nebula. Jake could imagine the alien crew struggling with the same sensor problems that plagued human ships in this environment. The biomechanical vessel would be adapting to the conditions, but even alien technology had its limits when dealing with the chaotic energy fields of the Meridian Nebula. "Second contact," Helen reported. "Another scout ship, different vector. They're spreading out to map the nebula." Jake nodded. This was exactly what he had expected. The Zephyrians were too smart to charge blindly into unknown territory. They would send scouts first to find safe passages for their larger ships. The question was whether the human ships could remain hidden long enough for the main fleet to commit to entering the nebula. 20 minutes later, the tactical situation changed dramatically. "Multiple contacts," Helen announced, her voice tight with tension. "I count at least 15 ships emerging from hyperspace at the nebula entrance. Classification shows destroyers and cruisers. No dreadnoughts yet." Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The Zephyrians were bringing their advance force into the nebula while keeping their most powerful ships in reserve. It was a smart, tactical move that would force the human ships to reveal their positions or let the enemy scouts find them. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Danny Carter from the communication station, "I'm picking up some kind of transmission between the enemy ships. It's heavily encoded, but the signal strength suggests they're coordinating a systematic search pattern." The waiting became almost unbearable as alien ships moved through the nebula like hunters tracking prey. Jake watched the tactical display as red dots appeared and disappeared in the swirling chaos of gas and rock. The enemy was getting closer to the canyon where the human ships waited. Navigation Officer Amy Foster highlighted a section of her screen. "Captain, one of the scout ships is heading directly for our position. Range is down to 5 kilometers and closing." Jake made a decision that would determine the outcome of everything that followed. "All ships, prepare to engage. Wait for my signal." Throughout the 4 human vessels, weapon systems powered up to full capacity. Targeting computers locked onto the approaching enemy ship, and crew members took their positions for battle. The modified plasma torpedoes were loaded and ready, each one carrying enough explosive power to destroy a normal ship with a single hit. The Zephyrian scout entered the canyon at a cautious pace, its biomechanical hull gleaming with an eerie blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The alien ship was smaller than the human destroyers but moved with a fluid grace that spoke of advanced technology and deadly purpose. "Range 2 kilometers, Amy reported. "The scout is scanning our position." Jake knew they had perhaps 30 seconds before the enemy ship detected them and called for reinforcements. "All ships, target the scout vessel. Fire on my mark." The canyon erupted in brilliant flashes of light as 4 human ships opened fire simultaneously. Enhanced plasma torpedoes streaked through space like miniature suns, their supercharged warheads leaving trails of energy in the nebula's dense atmosphere. The concentrated firepower hit the Zephyrian scout. Before it could react or adapt its defenses, the alien ship simply ceased to exist. Where moments before there had been a sleek vessel of biomechanical engineering, now there was only expanding debris and fading energy signatures. The enhanced weapons had performed exactly as Chief Engineer Pete Hamilton had promised. "Direct hit," reported Tactical Officer Roy Jenkins with satisfaction. "Target destroyed." But Jake knew their problems were just beginning. The destruction of the scout ship would alert the rest of the Zephyrian fleet to their presence. Within minutes, every alien ship in the nebula would be converging on their position. "All ships, prepare for incoming enemy vessels," Jake broadcast. "This is where the real fight begins." The response came faster than anyone had expected. 3 Zephyrian destroyers appeared at the canyon entrance, their weapons already charging for combat. These ships were larger than the Scout and moved with the deadly coordination that had made the alien fleet so successful in previous battles. "Multiple contacts at the canyon entrance," Helen reported. 3 destroyers in attack formation. They're adapting their hull configuration for nebula operations. Jake watched as the alien ships began to change their appearance, their biomechanical hulls shifting and flowing like living metal. Sensor baffles extended from their sides to deal with the electromagnetic interference, and weapon pods rotated into firing positions. The Zephyrians were preparing for a fight in an environment they had never encountered before. "All ships, engage at will," Jake ordered. "Concentrate fire on the lead destroyer." The battle began in earnest as human and alien weapons lit up the nebula with deadly energy. The enhanced plasma torpedoes from the human ship struck the lead Zephyrian destroyer, but this time the alien vessel was ready. Its adaptive armor absorbed much of the impact, and repair systems immediately began fixing the damage. Return fire from the aliens was like nothing the human crews had ever experienced. Beams of coherent energy that seemed to bend space itself lanced out from the Zephyrian ships. Where they struck the asteroid walls, solid rock simply vanished as if it had never existed. The UES Hornet took a direct hit that punched through its forward armor and destroyed 2 weapon turrets. Captain Susan Lee's voice came over the radio, steady despite the damage her ship had taken. "Hornet is still operational, but we've lost 30% of our firepower." Jake realized that even with their enhanced weapons, the human ships were outmatched by the alien technology. The Zephyrians were adapting to their tactics in real time, and more enemy ships were entering the canyon every minute. "Amy, how much time do we need to buy the evacuation fleet?" Jake asked. "Still 8 hours, sir," came the reply that Jake had been dreading. 8 hours was an eternity in space combat, especially against an enemy that learned from every exchange of fire. But Jake Morrison had not come this far to give up when innocent lives were still at stake. "All ships, fall back to defensive position beta," he ordered. "We're going to make them fight for every meter of this canyon." The 4 human ships began a fighting withdrawal deeper into the asteroid maze, using the massive rocks for cover while they traded shots with an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. The real battle for the Meridian Nebula had begun, and the fate of 60,000 civilians hung in the balance. Chief Engineer Pete Hamilton reported over the intercom that the Liberty's reactor was running at 100% of rated capacity. The enhanced weapons were draining power faster than anticipated, and critical systems were showing signs of strain. Jake looked around the bridge at his crew, seeing determination mixed with growing concern on their faces. They all knew the mathematics of their situation, but they also knew that sometimes courage could overcome impossible odds. The next few hours would test that belief to its absolute limit. 6 hours into the battle, the canyon looked like a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered dreams. The UES Hornet had been destroyed an hour ago when 3 Zephyrian cruisers overwhelmed its defenses. Captain Susan Lee and her crew of 200 had died fighting to the last breath, taking one of the alien ships with them. The UES Ranger had suffered massive damage and was running on emergency power, its weapon systems barely functional. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Liberty, watching as another wave of enemy ships entered the canyon. His uniform was torn and stained with blood from a piece of shrapnel that had cut his arm when the ship took a direct hit. Around him, his crew worked at stations that sparked and smoked from battle damage, but their determination had never wavered. Reactor. Temperature is at 115%, reported Chief Engineer Pete Hamilton over the intercom. His voice was hoarse from breathing the acrid smoke that filled the engine room. We've got maybe 30 more minutes before the containment field fails completely. The tactical display showed a situation that should have been hopeless. 23 Zephyrian ships now filled the canyon, with more arriving every few minutes. The alien vessels had adapted to the nebula conditions and were pressing their attack with the relentless efficiency that had conquered 17 human worlds. But somehow, the 3 remaining human ships were still fighting. "Sir, message from the evacuation fleet," reported Lieutenant Danny Carter. "They're 2 hours away from the jump point. Captain Rodriguez says the civilian ships are pushing their engines beyond safe limits." Jake felt a surge of fierce pride. The evacuation fleet was going to make it. 60,000 innocent people would live because a handful of warships had decided to make a stand in an impossible place. Whatever happened in the next 2 hours, they had already won the only victory that mattered. "All ships, this is Liberty Actual," Jake broadcast to the surviving vessels. "We've held them for 6 hours. The civilians are almost safe. Whatever happens now, we've done our job." Captain Beth Sullivan's voice came back from the U.E.'s Defiant, her ship barely holding together after taking dozens of hits. "Copy that, Jake. It's been an honor serving with you." Captain Tom Bradley of the damaged Ranger added his own farewell. "We'll hold the line to the end, for humanity." A new alarm sounded on the Liberty's bridge as sensor operator Helen Clark detected something that made her face go pale. "Captain, massive hyperspace signature at the canyon entrance. It's bigger than anything we've seen before." The tactical display updated to show a ship that dwarfed everything else in the battle. The Zephyrian dreadnought was over 2 kilometers long, its biomechanical hull covered with weapon systems that could reduce planets to rubble. This was the kind of ship that led invasions and broke entire star systems. "Well," Jake said quietly, "I guess they're tired of playing games." The dreadnought moved into the canyon with ponderous grace, its massive bulk filling the space between the asteroid walls. Secondary weapon turrets, the size of destroyers, tracked the 3 remaining human ships, while its main guns powered up with energy signatures that made the space around them ripple and navigation. Officer Amy Foster looked up from her station, with tears in her eyes. "Sir, the evacuation fleet reports successful hyperspace jump. All civilian ships are away safe." For a moment, the bridge was completely silent except for the sound of damaged systems struggling to function. They had done it. Against impossible odds, with inferior numbers and failing equipment, they had bought enough time for 60,000 people to escape. Jake activated the ship's internal communication system one final time. "All hands, this is the captain. The evacuation fleet has jumped to safety. Every person on those ships is alive because of what we've done here today. I want you to know that I've never been more proud to serve with anyone in my life." Throughout the ship, crew members took a moment to absorb the magnitude of what they had accomplished. In the medical bay, Dr. Karen White continued treating wounded sailors while tears ran down her face. In the weapons bay, the surviving gunners checked their remaining ammunition and prepared for one last fight. Chief Engineer Pete Hamilton made his way to the bridge, leaving his post for the first time since the battle began. His uniform was blackened with soot and his hands were burned from emergency repairs, but his eyes were bright with determination. "Captain," Pete said, "I have an idea. If we overload the reactor completely and ram that dreadnought, we might be able to take it out. The explosion would probably collapse this whole section of the canyon." Jake looked at his old friend and engineer. Pete had been with him since the beginning, keeping the Liberty running through battles that should have destroyed them both. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 10 minutes before the reactor goes critical, whether we want it to or not," Pete replied. "But if we do this right, we can choose where and when it happens." The Dreadnought's main guns were almost fully charged, their energy output making the nebula itself glow with unnatural light. In a few minutes, those weapons would fire and erase the 3 human ships from existence. But Jake Morrison had one card left to play. "Amy, plot a ramming course for the Dreadnought's command section," Jake ordered. "Maximum speed." Amy's hands moved over her controls with practiced efficiency, even though she knew she was plotting the course that would end all their lives. "Ramming course laid in, Captain. Time to impact, 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Jake looked around the bridge at the people who had become his family during 3 years of war. They had shared victories and defeats, celebrations and funerals. Now they would share one final moment of perfect courage. "It's been the greatest honor of my life to serve with all of you," Jake said. "We're about to show the galaxy that humans don't surrender when innocent lives are at stake." The Liberty's engines roared to full power, pushing the damaged destroyer toward the massive alien dreadnought at a speed that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The ship's hull groaned under the stress, and sparks flew from overloaded systems throughout the vessel. The Zephyrian ship tried to turn away, but its enormous size worked against it in the confined space of the canyon. The alien captain had never faced an enemy willing to sacrifice everything in a ramming attack, and precious seconds were lost in confusion. 30 seconds to impact, Amy reported, her voice steady despite everything. Jake thought about the evacuation ships, now safely in hyperspace, carrying families to new worlds where they could rebuild their lives. He thought about the children, who would grow up free, because a few hundred people had chosen to stand in the gap when darkness threatened to swallow everything. 10 seconds, Amy announced. Jake closed his eyes and spoke the words that would be remembered throughout human space for generations to come. "For every soul we saved. For every child who will see tomorrow. This is Liberty, going to ramming speed." The collision between the Liberty and the Dreadnought released energy equal to a small star. The explosion tore through both ships and sent shockwaves through the nebula that could be seen from 3 star systems away. The blast caused a chain reaction that brought down the massive asteroids forming the canyon walls, sealing the passage with millions of tons of rock and debris. When the Zephyrian fleet finally cleared the wreckage weeks later, they found only a memorial beacon left by the evacuation fleet. The message was simple, but it carried the power to inspire an entire species. Here stood the crew of the UE's Liberty and her brave companions. They held the line so that others might live. Remember them, for they showed the galaxy what it means to be human. The invasion continued, but it had been slowed and weakened. More importantly, the story of the Liberty's stand spread throughout human space, inspiring resistance movements and giving hope to worlds that had seemed doomed. Captain Jake Morrison and his crew never lived to see the final victory over the Zephyrians, but they had given humanity something more valuable than any single battle, proof that courage and sacrifice could triumph over overwhelming darkness. In the end, one small ship and its determined crew had changed the course of history by refusing to abandon those who needed them most.